Well, I'm going to show a photograph of him in 1854. And if you want to know what the animal himself was like, that's what it was.
In black and white.
There you go.
That Brillo pad on his head,
Yep.
and that tie from shoulder to shoulder. How Mary let him out, I don't know. But that was him. And he looked a bit like what you talk about a bit in the book about white trash.
Absolutely.
And
yeah.
people looking at him may have inferred, especially before he put that coat on, there was white trash. Yet until he opened his mouth.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then people saw something differently.
Sure.
So what was Lincoln's, what propelled him to leave Thomas's home, his dad, and what was his idea of equality? You talk about that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
how it was partially an economic move,
Yeah.
not just hatred of his dad.
Yeah.
Talk about this and how we try to get away from that white trash idea.
One of the points I wanted to make in the book is we tend to romanticize the frontier Lincoln these days. He's the rail splitter. He is the frontier man made good, and we tend to think that that's all positive. But if you strip away the legend that we all have in our heads and you look at what he actually was, a young man growing up on the frontier, it would have fit perfectly in the stereotypes of the day that were called white trash. In fact, the term white trash was coming into general usage at about the time he's becoming a young man. And it's variants, white trash, poor white trash,
Is
cracker.
that a northern or southern or universal?
Mostly southern, although I found there were northern examples as well. It's a little hard to trace the exact origins, but I've seen references to white trash going back to like 1818, some novels and some things like that. And what I argue is that Abraham Lincoln would have been susceptible to people looking at him and saying there is a white trash specimen. Now, what does that mean back then? Well, the stereotype back then was that white trash meant that you were ignorant, no education, that you were shiftless and lazy, and that you drank a lot. And that you married your cousin. There's all that sort of thing going on. Well, it is, and it's funny because now you look at Lincoln and the choices he made when he was a young man. He is a very hard worker. Everybody says this. But he's not lazy. He is self-educated, almost a mania for reading everything that he can get. That it fits way outside the boundaries of a white trash stereotype. He does not drink, which is very unusual back then. If you were to make a checklist of the things you need to do to avoid being a white trash stereotype, he would be checking that list off. Because I think he did not want to be thought of as white trash. He didn't want to be thought of as Thomas Lincoln because he didn't have a good relationship with his father. And the choices that he made to go be a lawyer and a politician, to move to Springfield, the biggest town that he had available to him, and to marry Mary Todd Lincoln, who had a very, aristocratic bearing, brought him out of that white trash background and into respectable white society. Absolutely. And economically speaking, that's how he defines equality, is rich and poor, which is a different thing than if you asked a black person back then what equality meant, or what a Native American thought of as equality. White people, when they thought of it, was, poor white trash or rich white folks, one or the other. And that's where he conceptualizes all of this. Yeah.
Also, on that point, one of the reasons two reasons that I see, and you bring up in your book, about Thomas Lincoln taking Abraham and the family out of Kentucky, slavery, or economics, having to deal with the black labor force. And to me, maybe it's semantics when you say it's somewhere in between. I think it's both.
I can see that, sure,
and
absolutely. Yeah.
They just both propelled them out of there and into Indiana at that time. So that was kind of an interesting aside that you had in there. You talked about all the intersects of lawyers during the Civil War. We're kind of going back and forth here to things. Were there a couple of ironic intersects besides? To me, Stanton and Lincoln certainly is one. But that shows who Lincoln was much more than anything else, although Stanton came around to seeing what Lincoln really was as well, and the mistake he may have made, even though it was never brought up again. But Lincoln was able to put aside his hurt feelings and bring someone in whom he thought he needed. But what other lawyers were kind of ironic in their intersex during the war from previous?
Well, I have a whole appendix
A wonderful appendix there.
of the intersections, and there's a whole bunch of them. You get somebody like Reverdy Johnson, as I said, who won the Dred Scott case. Yet, when the war was ending, teamed up with the former Postmaster General, who lost the Dred Scott case, in defending in the Supreme Court civil liberties involving the test oaths. So you have these strange bedfellows that were all over the place on both sides all the time, and you have very often at the time. Today we would squawk about inappropriateness, but you had the brothers of Supreme Court justices arguing a case, and miraculously the Supreme Court justice happened to agree with his brother's argument. And
go figure.
Nobody thought that was a problem, and that was just fine. But that happened in Field, for example, Justice Field and his brother, former law partners. Oh, really? Tell me about that.
I don't like lists, but I'm going to ask for one. Maybe you're off the top of your head, 3 lawyers who made differences during the Civil War, who really were maybe made in some issue, made a real difference in the Civil War period.
I should have thought of that question, and
That's why I asked.
I don't have, but I didn't. I don't have a good answer. I would think clearly, number one, Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
He, I think, obviously he made a big difference, but I think he struggled all the time with. Remember, in his first inaugural, he said, "I have no inclination and I have no legal right. I have no legal authority to interfere with slavery in the States." And then less than 2 years later, he's emancipating the slaves in the South. How does he square this? That's a struggle for him, I think. Or other actions, the suspension of habeas corpus. Here's a lawyer who treasured civil liberties. And here he suppressed in secret the most fundamental of our civil liberties, the writ of habeas corpus, that was in the Constitution before there were amendments to the Constitution, before the First Amendment. Extraordinary. He struggled with that. And I think he kept saying to himself, I have no evidence of this, but I think he kept saying, look, I'm a good lawyer, and I know this is not so good, but I got to do it to preserve the Union, and this is no precedent for other people later on. And so I think he struggled. I think
the habeas corpus issue is one that comes up today. 2 examples. I have a cousin, a libertarian, who bashes me every time I see him about Lincoln and habeas corpus and civil liberties. Then again, President Musharraf of Pakistan cited Lincoln as and his animosity to civil liberties.
You did read the book, because that's in there.
Yes,
That's when
it
Musharraf moved from speaking in Urdu to speaking in English. He was addressing the American market.
Okay.
Good for you.
So good for you for putting that in, because that does show that it's still a lively issue. Thank you. And of course, in your Constitution book, Brian, you talk about this as well.
Mm-hmm.
Tell both of you, give me the issue of habeas corpus, and was he right in doing it, and should he have done it, and are we lucky that it was Lincoln and not maybe McClellan?
Art, do you
I'm always bashing McClellan, aren't I?
I think he was wrong to do it in the way he did it, for sure.
He had other avenues.
I think, for me, the worst part of what he did was to do it in secret. You don't tell the press, you don't issue a proclamation, you don't notify the courts or anybody, and you delegate the right to suspend habeas corpus, a power that the Queen of England didn't have. She could not suspend the writ of habeas corpus. And you did it all, and you delegate that to a military officer to decide when to suspend. Not good. And I think he knew it. And he got caught. And it was Reverdy Johnson who he called in and said, "Reverdy, baby, you're a good friend of Chief Justice Tawney. You guys practice law together in a way. I'd like you to support me on this one. And
Well, he did.
the Maryland case, the one that started, was on Reverend E. Johnson's turf. And Reverend E. Johnson stepped up to the plate. So he was consequential also and said, I support what the president did, but he did it in a way that was respectful of the Chief Justice, his old friend.
Yeah, I can see that. Well, yeah, I deal with this in my Lincoln the Constitution book, and I tend to agree. I tend to think that Lincoln was skirting some very gray areas here, and falling off on occasion. Okay, if you break down how he did it, it's interesting because he at first issues a suspension of the writ, gives the power to Winfield Scott, and tailors it along very narrow lines. He says only suspend the writ along the avenues of reinforcements of soldiers between Washington, D.C. and the sources coming through Maryland. Because remember, the problem was trying to get men into Washington, D.C. to defend the Capitol. That's what he's worried about. And in those early days, that's what he really cares about, is to get guys in Washington. There had been a riot that had gotten some soldiers killed in Baltimore. There's only one way into Washington, D.C., and it's through Baltimore. He wants to get soldiers in. So when he first does it, he has this kind of getting my toe wet, okay, let's see what's going to happen here, and then nobody notices, because you're right, he does it in secret. Nobody really pays attention. Then he gets a little bolder, and then finally the big blow up with Tawney. Lincoln never conceded the unconstitutionality of his actions. He said in Article 1, there is no specifier as to who suspends the writ. Now, he's being a little disingenuous there, because most every legal authority prior to that point said Congress does this. But he never conceded that he had done something wrong. He kind of says, I didn't do anything wrong, but if I did, then I did it to save the Union. And it's Lincoln, I agree, it's Lincoln probably knowing he's pushing it here, but being a good lawyer, he understands that he can make an argument, and he makes an argument.
Well, that one law. He kept going back to that one law. So
Yeah.
this one law, pretty fundamental thing, but nonetheless, not be abrogated and everything else go to hell.
It made Congress so nervous that when Congress retroactively approved all of his actions, they didn't approve that until later on in '63 when they passed the Habeas Corpus Act.
There was a marvelous scene, because there was an alternative way around Baltimore, as you know.
The sea was one.
Where General Butler, Ben Butler, came down to Annapolis by sea and then into Washington.
Another fine lawyer.
And everybody was a lawyer. But you had this bizarre scene where just before that, Gideon Welles had contacted the superintendent of the Naval Academy. And Old Ironsides, the great old battleship, was used at the Naval Academy in Annapolis as kind of a floating classroom. And Welles said, protect Old Ironsides at all costs. And if the Confederates come to go after it, scuttle it. That's serious. We have to protect the Constitution, Old Ironsides. So Ben Butler shows up in his resplendent uniform and says to the Admiral, hello, here I am. And the superintendent of the Naval Academy says, are you here to save the Constitution? Thinking. And Ben Butler says, of course, we're all here to save the Constitution. And you can see these two guys looking at each other and saying, oh my God, what are we talking about?
Butler's one of my favorite characters, a great lawyer, horrible general, and I deal with him a little bit in that book too, because he's the one that came up with the legal definition of a slave as, quote, contraband, and did Lincoln a favor in some ways, did the country a favor in finding a legal way to allow slaves not to be the property of their owners.
The beast.
The beast, absolutely.
You talk about both a low point and I think a high point of Lincoln. A low point is his meeting in August of 1862 with black leaders, which really showed kind of the divide of white and black in this country. Especially at that time more than anything else. But then how he also went on during his presidency to normalize the African American, the freedmen, the servants that were there, in fact, and normalize them a bit. Speak about both of those.
Yeah, in my opinion, and I don't think I'm alone here. I really think probably the worst mistake he made in his presidency other than Andrew Johnson as vice president, but we'll go to that later. But I mean, I think the worst mistake he made was that meeting with this delegation of African American ministers who came to the White House in the summer of '62. And Lincoln called them in. He literally said, "I want you guys to come to the White House. I have something to say to you." Obviously, a public meeting. He wanted this to go in the newspapers, and he has the Emancipation Proclamation, a draft of it anyway, written. I mean, he knows he's going to emancipate the slaves, and he calls these men in, and he gives them a lecture and says, "If it wasn't for you being here, none of this would have happened. You mean black people." There's one of the quotes is he says, "See how white men are cutting each other's throats, and we know not where it's going to end. You and I are of different races. I can't do anything about that. You can't do anything about that. Therefore, I think the best thing for everybody is for us to separate." And he urges them to pursue colonization and some scheme by which black people would remove themselves from the country. That is an important distinction. Lincoln never backed deportation. He wasn't trying to engage in ethnic cleansing, in Lerone Bennett's rather unwieldy phrase. But he wanted black people to voluntarily remove themselves out of the country. And black observers like Frederick Douglass were livid. Now, Douglass wrote in his papers, "How dare you blame this war on us?" You know, he doesn't say it quite this way, but he's blaming the victim. You know, I mean, we're the ones who got messed up by the slave system, and now you're paying the price, and you're mad at us. You know,